The afternoon of November 17th, 1943. Inside the Naval General Staff offices in Tokyo, Commander Nakamura Toshio stood before a wall-mounted map of the Pacific, his fingers tracing supply routes that no longer existed. On his desk lay a decoded American radio intercept, unremarkably except for a single detail that had kept him awake for 3 consecutive nights. The message mentioned routine destroyer movements, 7 ships, operating together, in a single task group, off Bougainville, 7 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 9 in the previous month alone. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question that haunted Nakamura was not about individual battles or tactical defeats. It was about something far more existential, something that struck at the foundation of Japanese naval planning since the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. The question was simple. What happens when your enemy can build warships faster than you can sink them? Not battleships, not carriers, destroyers. The workhorses of naval warfare. The unglamorous vessels that escorted convoys, hunted submarines, screened larger ships, and cut supply lines. The Americans were building them at a rate that defied every calculation, every assessment, every war game the Imperial Navy had conducted before Pearl Harbor. By the end of the war, the United States would launch 349 destroyers. Japan, in that same period, would complete 32. This is not a story about carriers or battleships, the glamorous capital ships that dominated naval propaganda and newsreels. This is about the grinding reality of industrial warfare, about how steel production and shipyard capacity proved more decisive than tactical brilliance or warrior spirit. It is about the moment when Japanese naval planners realized they were not just losing a war, they were being buried under an avalanche of American manufacturing capacity that grew stronger with each passing month. The roots of this realization stretched back 2 decades, to the naval conferences that followed the First World War. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty imposed strict limits on capital ship construction. Japan received a ratio of 3 capital ships for every 5 built by the United States or Britain. The treaty's architects believed they were preventing an arms race. What they actually created was a Japanese naval doctrine built entirely around the decisive battle, the single climactic engagement that would destroy the enemy's battle line and win the war in an afternoon. The Imperial Japanese Navy studied this problem with monastic devotion. If they could not match American numbers in battleships and carriers, they would achieve qualitative superiority so overwhelming that numbers became irrelevant. Japanese torpedoes would be larger, faster, and more reliable than anything the Americans possessed. Japanese night-fighting techniques would be practiced until they became second nature. Japanese destroyer captains would train for the knife-fight engagement, the close-range night battle where superior skill and determination could overwhelm numerical advantage. By 1941, Japan possessed what many observers considered the world's finest destroyers. The Fubuki class, introduced in the late 1920s, carried 6 5-inch guns in fully enclosed turrets and 9 24-inch torpedo tubes capable of launching the Type 93's long lance, a weapon that could travel 24 miles at 48 knots. American destroyers of the same period carried 12 21-inch tubes, launching torpedoes with roughly 1/3 that range. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized aggressive night attacks against enemy capital ships. Destroyers would approach under cover of darkness, launch massive torpedo spreads at long range, and withdraw before the enemy could respond. This was not defensive warfare. This was offensive doctrine built around the idea that superior Japanese destroyers, crewed by superior Japanese sailors, would devastate American formations before the battle lines ever closed. The Battle of Savo Island, in the early morning hours of August 9, 1942, seemed to validate everything the Imperial Navy believed about destroyer warfare. A Japanese force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer surprised an Allied screening force off Guadalcanal. In 32 minutes of savage close-range combat, Japanese forces sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers and damaged 2 others, while suffering only moderate damage to a single cruiser. It was the worst defeat the United States Navy had suffered at sea since the War of 1812. What Japanese planners failed to recognize was that Savo Island represented peak Japanese naval capability meeting an American force. Still learning how to fight a modern naval war, the United States Navy in August of 1942 was not the United States Navy that would emerge by 1944. And more importantly, the Americans were not trying to outbuild Japanese quality. They were simply going to bury Japan under sheer numerical superiority. The Fletcher-class destroyer program began production in June of 1942. The design was not revolutionary. It mounted 5 5-inch guns in single turrets and 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. It displaced 2,100 tons and could make 36 knots. On paper, it was inferior to the latest Japanese destroyers in almost every category except one: producibility. Standardized equipment. Simplified maintenance. Everything about the design prioritized getting ships from the drawing board to the water as quickly as possible. The Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Kearney, New Jersey, could complete a Fletcher-class destroyer in approximately 6 months from the laying of the keel to SEA trials. By the end of 1942, the first Fletcher-class destroyers were entering service. By mid-1943, they were coming off the ways at a rate of 3 per month. By 1944, that rate had accelerated to nearly 5 per month at multiple shipyards simultaneously. This was the reality that Commander Nakamura studied in his Tokyo office in November of 1943. Intelligence reports from agents in neutral ports confirmed what seemed impossible. American shipyards were producing destroyers faster than Japan could produce the torpedoes to sink them. The mathematics were straightforward and terrifying. In 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy completed 8 new destroyers. That same year, American shipyards launched 79. The ratio was nearly 10 to 1, and it was getting worse. But the numbers told only part of the story. Japanese destroyers, for all their technical sophistication, were being ground down in battles of attrition that Japan could not afford to fight. Every engagement in the Solomon Islands, every night action off New Guinea, every attempt to reinforce isolated garrisons, cost Japan destroyers it could not replace. The Tokyo Express, the high-speed destroyer runs that supplied Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, became known to American forces as the Rat Run. Fast destroyers would race down the slot between the Solomon Islands under cover of darkness, drop supplies and reinforcements, and attempt to withdraw before dawn brought American air attacks. These runs were operationally necessary. They were also unsustainable. Between August of 1942 and February of 1943, Japan lost 16 destroyers in the waters around Guadalcanal. Some fell to American destroyers in night actions. Others died under air attack during daylight withdrawals. A few struck mines. The causes varied, but the result was constant attrition that Japan's industrial base simply could not match. The Battle of Vella Gulf, on the night of August 6, 1943, demonstrated how rapidly American destroyer doctrine was evolving. 6 American Fletcher-class destroyers intercepted 4 Japanese destroyers attempting to reinforce Villa on Colombangara. The American commander, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, executed a textbook torpedo attack. His destroyers launched 24 torpedoes at ranges between 4,000 and 5,000 yards. 3 Japanese destroyers were hit and sank within minutes. The 4th escaped with damage. Not a single American ship was scratched. It was Savo Island in reverse. American destroyers, using tactics refined through bitter experience, had achieved the kind of one-sided victory that Japanese doctrine had always claimed for itself. More importantly, the Americans had done it with a numerical advantage they could sustain indefinitely. 6 American destroyers. 6, any one of which could be replaced by a new hull within months. By late 1943, Japanese naval intelligence officers like Nakamura were beginning to understand that the war had fundamentally changed. Carrier aviation dominated the headlines and captured public attention, but it was destroyer production that was slowly strangling Japan's ability to wage war. Every supply convoy needed escorts. Every carrier task force needed screening ships. Every amphibious operation needed fire support vessels. And the Americans had destroyers for all of it, with more arriving every month. The Allied advance across the Pacific was not primarily a carrier war, though carriers enabled it. It was a logistics war, a war of supply lines and convoy routes, a war where the side that could protect its merchant shipping while interdicting the enemy's would ultimately prevail. And in that war, destroyers were the essential weapon. Japanese merchant shipping losses told the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, Japan lost approximately 1.1 million tons of merchant shipping. In 1943, that figure rose to 1.8 million tons, and in 1944, it would reach 3.9 million tons. But submarines operated most effectively when enemy convoys lacked adequate destroyer escorts, and by 1944, Japanese convoys increasingly lacked those escorts because Japan simply did not have enough destroyers to screen its merchant fleet while simultaneously supporting fleet operations. The Imperial Navy faced an impossible choice: deploy destroyers to protect merchant convoys, and fleet operations became untenable. Deploy destroyers to support fleet operations, and watch merchant shipping losses climb to catastrophic levels. There was no good answer because there were not enough destroyers to do both jobs adequately. American destroyer construction, by contrast, proceeded without such constraints. In 1943, while Japan struggled to protect both its fleet and its supply lines, the United States commissioned 79 destroyers. These were not emergency conversions or pressed civilian vessels. These were purpose-built warships rolling off assembly lines with the same industrial efficiency that produced tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. The Federal Shipbuilding Yard at Kearney was just one facility among many. Bath Iron Works in Maine, Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding, Bethlehem Steel's yards in San Francisco and San Pedro, Consolidated Steel Corporation in Orange, Texas. Each could produce destroyers simultaneously. The production network was geographically dispersed, technologically redundant, and utterly beyond Japan's capacity to disrupt through military action. Commander Nakamura studied production schedules captured from Allied sources and verified through neutral observers. The numbers should have been impossible. The Federal Yard alone was projected to complete 24 Fletcher-class destroyers between 1942 and 1944. Bath Iron Works would add another 30. Seattle-Tacoma, despite being on the opposite coast, would contribute 19 more. By late 1943, American shipyards were already preparing to launch the Allen M Sumner class, an improved design with heavier anti-aircraft armament. The first Sumner-class destroyer, USS Allen M Sumner herself, was laid down in July of 1943 and commissioned in January of 1944. 6 months from keel to commissioning for a 2,200-ton warship with a crew of 340 men. Japan, by comparison, required approximately 14 to 18 months to complete a destroyer of comparable size. The disparity was not primarily technological. Japanese shipyards possessed the technical capability to build world-class destroyers. Japan lacked the steel, the electrical generators, the fire control systems, and most critically, the skilled labor pool to match American production rates. The Shimakaze, completed in May of 1943, exemplified both the strengths and limitations of Japanese destroyer construction. She was the fastest destroyer in the world, capable of 39 knots on trial runs. She mounted 15 24-inch torpedo tubes capable of launching the Type 93's long lance. She incorporated advanced turbine technology and represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval engineering. She was also the only ship of her class ever completed. The resources required to build Shimakaze could have produced 3 or 4 simpler destroyers. Japan chose quality over quantity because its industrial base left it no alternative. The Americans chose to build both in quantity because their industrial base made it possible. By early 1944, the strategic implications were becoming undeniable. The Central Pacific Offensive, launched with the assault on Tarawa in November of 1943, relied absolutely on destroyer strength. American amphib operations required destroyer fire support to suppress shore defenses. American carrier task forces required destroyer screens to protect against submarine and surface attack. American supply lines required destroyer escorts to ensure vital materials reached forward bases, and the Americans had destroyers for everything. Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force that spearheaded the Central Pacific Drive, operated with destroyer screens that fluctuated between 20 and 40 ships depending on operational requirements, 20 to 40 destroyers, supporting a single task force. The Japanese combined fleet, by contrast, struggled to assemble destroyer screens adequate to protect its remaining carriers and battleships. The mobile fleet, assembled for Operation Ago in June of 1944, sailed with approximately 24 destroyers screening 9 carriers and 5 battleships. This represented nearly half of Japan's remaining destroyer strength committed to a single operation. The disparity was not simply numerical. It was operational, strategic, and psychological. American destroyer captains could afford to take risks because damaged ships could be replaced. Japanese destroyer captains knew that every ship lost represented an irreplaceable asset. This awareness affected tactical decision-making in ways that no amount of training or warrior spirit could overcome. 19th and 20th, 1944, demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. American forces deployed 15 carriers and their escorts, including 7 battleships and 58 destroyers. Japanese forces fielded 9 carriers with their remaining escorts. The battle itself was a catastrophe for Japanese naval aviation, with over 300 aircraft lost in what American pilots dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the destroyer disparity told its own story. American destroyers formed multiple defensive rings around the carrier task forces, layered defenses that no Japanese air attack could penetrate. Japanese destroyers, fewer in number and increasingly short of fuel, could not provide equivalent protection. The carrier Hiyo, torpedoed by the submarine USS Kavala, might have survived with more aggressive damage control and more escort vessels providing assistance. She received neither because Japan no longer had the resources to provide either. After the Philippine Sea, Commander Nakamura's reports to the Naval General Staff became increasingly blunt. The mathematics of destroyer production, he argued, meant that Japan could not win a war of attrition in any theater. Every engagement, regardless of tactical outcome, favored the side that could replace losses more quickly. His superiors understood the implications but lacked options. Japan's shipbuilding capacity was already operating at maximum sustainable output. Raw materials were increasingly scarce. Skilled workers were being drafted into the army. Shipyards faced regular air raids that disrupted production schedules. And even if these problems could be solved, Japan lacked the time to close the production gap before American forces reached the home islands. The Americans, meanwhile, continued building destroyers at rates that seemed to mock every principle of naval arms limitation that had governed the interwar period. In 1944 alone, American shipyards would complete 137 destroyers. 137 in a single year. Japan would complete 7. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic consequences of this production disparity became most visible not in fleet engagements, but in the grinding daily work of convoy warfare. By 1944, the American submarine campaign against Japanese merchant shipping had achieved devastating effectiveness. But submarines alone did not win the war against Japanese logistics. Destroyers did. American destroyer escorts, a smaller and simpler variant of the fleet destroyer, entered production in massive numbers, beginning in 1943. These ships displaced approximately 1,400 tons, mounted 3 3-inch guns, and carried depth charges and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. They were not glamorous vessels. They were designed for a single purpose: protecting convoys from submarine attack. Between 1943 and 1945, American shipyards completed 563 destroyer escorts, 563. These ships freed fleet destroyers for offensive operations, while ensuring that American supply lines across the Pacific remained secure. Japanese submarines, hampered by outdated doctrine and inadequate numbers, posed minimal threat to American convoys because those convoys sailed with destroyer escort screens that outnumbered the entire Japanese submarine fleet. Japan possessed no equivalent program. Japanese escort vessels were conversions of older destroyers, purpose-built but underarmed Keiboken escorts, or requisitioned civilian vessels. These ships lacked the speed, armament, and anti-submarine equipment of American destroyer escorts. More critically, there were never enough of them. By mid-1944, Japanese merchant convoys sailed with minimal escorts or none at all. American submarines operated in wolf packs, coordinating attacks that overwhelmed the limited escort capability Japan could provide. The Convoy College, established by the Imperial Navy, attempted to train merchant captains in evasive tactics and anti-submarine procedures, but training could not substitute for adequate escort vessels. The destruction of Convoy High 71 Pulgada November of 1944 illustrated the consequences of inadequate destroyer protection. The convoy, consisting of 11 merchant ships carrying vital supplies from Southeast Asia to Japan, sailed with 2 escorts. The Kaibokan Seideventidos and the destroyer Shimakaze, the same vessel that represented the peak of Japanese destroyer technology. On November 11th, American submarines USS Kavaya, USS Place, and USS Snook intercepted the convoy in the South China Sea. The resulting attack sank 7 merchant ships totaling 41,000 tons. Shimakaze, for all her speed and firepower, could not defend against coordinated submarine attacks from multiple directions. She survived the engagement, but the convoy she was meant to protect did not. 3 weeks later, Shimakaze herself was gone, sunk during the air attacks on Manila Bay. The fastest destroyer in the world, overwhelmed by American carrier aircraft operating from task forces screened by dozens of American destroyers. The irony was complete. The problem extended beyond convoy protection. Destroyers performed myriad roles essential to modern naval warfare: amphibious fire support, radar picket duty, air rescue operations, bombardment of shore installations, anti-aircraft screening for capital ships, and fast transport of troops and supplies to isolated garrisons. Japan increasingly had to choose which missions it could afford to support and which it would abandon. Leyte Gulf, operation in October of 1944, demonstrated this reality with brutal clarity. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled virtually every operational warship for a final attempt to destroy American amphibious forces in the Philippines. The plan required 3 separate forces to converge on Leyte Gulf, catch American escort carriers unprotected, and annihilate them. Admiral Kurita's center force, the main striking force, included 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 13 destroyers. 13 destroyers to screen and support the largest Japanese battleships ever built. By comparison, the American Third Fleet operated with over 60 destroyers screening its carrier task forces. The disparity was so severe that Japanese forces could not adequately protect their own capital ships, while simultaneously conducting offensive torpedo attacks against American formations. During the Battle off Samar, part of the larger Leyte Gulf engagement, Kurita's force encountered an American escort carrier group designated Taffy 3. The American force consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. On paper, this was a catastrophic mismatch. Japanese battleships and cruisers against escort carriers and tin cans. What followed was one of the most remarkable actions in naval history. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts charged directly at the Japanese battle line, launching torpedoes and firing their 5-inch guns at battleships and cruisers. They created smoke screens, maneuvered aggressively, and traded their own lives to buy time for the escort carriers to escape. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, closed to within 10,000 yards of Japanese heavy cruisers and engaged them with main battery fire. Johnston was hit repeatedly, lost power, lost steering control, and eventually sank. But her aggressive action, combined with similar attacks by the destroyers Hole and Samuel B. Roberts, convinced Admiral Kurita that he faced a much larger American force than actually existed. Kurita withdrew. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and surviving escorts retreated from 6 escort carriers and 7 small escorts. The decision has been debated by historians for decades. But one factor was undeniable. Kurita could not afford to lose more destroyers. Every destroyer lost in pressing the attack was irreplaceable. Every engagement risked ships that the Imperial Navy desperately needed for other operations. The Americans lost 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts at Samar. Tragic losses, brave ships, skilled crews. Within 6 months, American shipyards would replace those losses several times over. Japan lost 6 destroyers during the entire late Gulf operation. Those losses could never be replaced. The mathematical reality was inescapable. By late 1944, American destroyer strength in the Pacific exceeded 200 ships. Japan retained perhaps 60. Operational destroyers scattered across multiple theaters. The ratio was more than 3-1, and it widened with each passing month. But numbers alone do not capture the full extent of American destroyer dominance. The Fletcher class and subsequent classes incorporated technological improvements that Japanese destroyers could not match in their final years. Rather, fire control systems allowed American destroyers to engage targets at night and in poor weather, with accuracy that seemed impossible to Japanese observers accustomed to optical rangefinders and visual targeting. The Battle of Surigao Strait, fought on the night of October 24th to 25th during Leyte Gulf, demonstrated this technological advantage conclusively. Admiral Nishimura's southern force, consisting of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers, attempted to transit Surigao Strait and enter Leyte Gulf from the south. Waiting for them were 6 American battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. The American destroyers made the first attacks, launching torpedo spreads guided by radar into Nishimura's formation. The destroyers, Mikishio, Asagumo, and Yamagumo, were hit and sank. By the time Nishimura's remaining ships reached the end of the strait, American battleships were tracking them on radar and firing from ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. It was an execution. Nishimura's force was annihilated with minimal American losses. Japanese destroyer torpedoes, once feared as the finest in the world, never found targets because American radar detected their firing positions and allowed American ships to maneuver clear. Japanese optical fire control, perfected through decades of night fighting exercises, was useless because American ships engaged from beyond visual range using radar. The Battle of Surigao Strait represented the final evolution of destroyer warfare in the Pacific. American destroyers, operating with technological superiority and overwhelming numbers, could control the tactical environment completely. Japanese destroyers, still technologically sophisticated but hopelessly outnumbered, could achieve local successes but could not influence strategic outcomes. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. Fuel shortages, personnel losses, and catastrophic ship losses in the Philippines reduced the combined fleet to scattered remnants. The few remaining destroyers were dispersed to defensive positions around the home islands, awaiting an invasion that would inevitably come. American destroyer production, by contrast, continued at full pace. The Gearing-class destroyers, an improved Fletcher design with increased endurance and heavier anti-aircraft armament, began entering service in mid-1944. Between 1944 and the end of the war, 98 Gearing-class destroyers would be completed or under construction. 98 additional destroyers, built to a standard superior to anything Japan had constructed during the entire war. The Kamikaze campaign, launched in desperation during the Philippines fighting and escalated during the Okinawa operation, demonstrated how completely Japanese naval strategy had collapsed. Destroyers, once employed in aggressive torpedo attacks and fleet screening missions, were now reduced to guarding kamikaze airfields and providing minimal escort for suicide aircraft. At Okinawa, from April through June of 1945, American forces deployed over 300 destroyers and destroyer escorts. These ships performed radar picket duty, protecting the invasion fleet from kamikaze attack. It was brutally dangerous work. Destroyers stationed on the radar picket line absorbed kamikaze strikes meant for carriers and battleships. American losses were significant. 15 destroyers sunk, dozens damaged. But the Americans could sustain such losses. For every destroyer sunk at Okinawa, 2 more were completing SEA trials in American shipyards. The mathematics that Commander Nakamura had studied in his Tokyo office in 1943 had played out exactly as he feared. America's industrial capacity had buried Japanese naval power under an avalanche of steel. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States completed 349 destroyers and 563 destroyer escorts, 912 major escort and destroyer-type vessels in 4 years. Japan completed 32 destroyers in the same period. The ratio was not 3-1, as the Washington Treaty had specified for battleships. It was not even 10-1. And when destroyer escorts were included, the ratio exceeded 50-1. These numbers represented more than statistical abstractions. They represented the material reality that determined who could protect their supply lines, who could escort their carriers, who could support amphibious operations, who could hunt submarines, who could defend against air attack, and ultimately, who could sustain modern naval warfare. Japanese destroyer captains, among the finest naval officers of their generation, found themselves commanding ships they could not risk losing in battles they could not afford to fight. American destroyer captains commanded ships that, while valued, were ultimately replaceable components in an industrial machine that produced warships with the same efficiency it produced automobiles. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was profound. Officers who had trained their entire careers for the decisive battle, for the climactic engagement where skill and spirit would overcome material disadvantage, discovered that no amount of skill could compensate for a 30-1 numerical disparity. Bushido spirit, the emphasis on fighting spirit and warrior tradition, meant nothing when the enemy could absorb losses and continue fighting while you could not. Commander Nakamura survived the war. His detailed intelligence assessments, filed throughout 1943 and 1944, were later studied by American naval historians. They revealed a clear understanding of Japan's strategic situation and an accurate assessment of American industrial capacity. His recommendations, calling for immediate negotiations while Japan still retained some bargaining power, were ignored by senior officers who believed that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. By 1945, those senior officers were either dead or presiding over the dismemberment of the Imperial Navy. The destroyers they had counted on to win the decisive battle were scattered across the Pacific floor, victims of submarines, aircraft, and American destroyers that simply outnumbered them, beyond any possibility of tactical success. The story of American destroyer production is often overlooked in favor of more dramatic narratives about carrier battles or submarine warfare. But it was destroyer production, unglamorous and methodical, that enabled everything else. Carriers could not operate without destroyer screens. Submarines operated most effectively when enemy convoys lacked adequate escorts. Amphibious operations required destroyer fire support. Supply lines depended on destroyer protection. The Americans understood this reality and built accordingly. They designed destroyers for mass production. They built shipyards that could produce those destroyers efficiently. They trained crews that could operate those destroyers effectively. And they sustained that production throughout the war, regardless of tactical setbacks or operational challenges. Japan, constrained by limited industrial capacity and strategic miscalculations, could not compete in this arena. Japanese, Destroyers were often technically superior to their American counterparts on a ship-to-ship basis, but technical superiority meant nothing when facing numerical odds of 10 to 1 or 20 to 1. Quality could not overcome quantity when the quantity disparity was so overwhelming. The final irony was that Japan's strategic doctrine, refined over decades of careful study, had prepared them to fight the wrong war. Japanese naval officers trained for the decisive battle where skill and superior equipment would triumph. They prepared for a war of quality versus quantity, assuming that superior Japanese quality would prevail. What they encountered instead was a war where the enemy achieved both quality and quantity. American destroyers by 1944 matched or exceeded Japanese destroyers in most technical categories, while being produced in numbers that made tactical skill almost irrelevant. The decisive battle never came because the Americans did not need a decisive battle. They simply needed to keep building destroyers until Japanese resistance collapsed. Under the weight of accumulated losses, Japan could not replace. When American forces occupied Japan in September of 1945, they found shipyards that had been attempting to construct destroyers until the final weeks of the war. Some hulls were still on the ways, incomplete, and destined to be scrapped. Others had been damaged by American air raids and abandoned. The facilities existed. The technical knowledge existed. What did not exist was the raw materials, the electrical generators, the fire control systems, the skilled labor, and most fundamentally, the time necessary to close a production gap that had grown into an unbridgeable chasm. The destroyer gap was never about technology. It was about industrial capacity, strategic vision, and the willingness to subordinate individual ship quality to overall fleet numbers. The Americans understood that modern naval warfare required both quality and quantity. Japan, through a combination of industrial limitations and strategic miscalculation, committed to quality alone. The result was foreordained once American shipyards reached full production capacity. Every calculation Commander Nakamura made in his Tokyo office in late 1943 proved accurate. The mathematics of destroyer production determined the war's outcome as surely as any fleet battle or amphibious landing. Japan could not win a war of attrition against an enemy that could build 30 destroyers for every one Japan completed. The 349 American destroyers, launched between 1941 and 1945, represented more than just ships. They represented a fundamental transformation in how naval warfare was conducted. The age of the decisive battle, where tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage, had ended. It was replaced by an age of industrial warfare, where production capacity and logistical sustainability determined outcomes more surely than any individual engagement. Japanese naval officers, trained in a tradition that emphasized spiritual factors and warrior virtue, struggled to adapt to this new reality. They fought bravely, often brilliantly, with the resources available to them. But bravery and brilliance could not substitute for adequate numbers of ships, adequate supplies of fuel, or adequate industrial capacity to replace losses. The destroyers that Japan feared most were not any specific class or design. They were the destroyers that arrived month after month, an unending stream of vessels that American shipyards produced with mechanical efficiency. Each individual destroyer might be sunk, damaged, or defeated, but the stream never ended. For every destroyer lost, 2 more appeared. For every tactical victory, strategic defeat grew more certain. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.